Hey everybody, this is a chapter from Maximilien Rubel's and Margaret Manale's Marx Without Myth, a chronological study of his life and work. This chapter is titled Karl Marx 1818 to 1843. This is in distinction from the previous section, which was a chronology of the historical events of Marx's time. The first section, 1818 to 1834. Born in Trier in the Prussian Rhineland on May 5, 1818, Karl Marx was the third of 9 children. 2 of his brothers and 3 sisters died at early ages of tuberculosis. Their parents were the lawyers Heinrich Marx, who lived from 1782 to 1838, and his wife Henriette née Pressburg, who lived from 1787 to 1863, both descended from long lines of rabbinical families. Heinrich Marx, a patriotic Prussian citizen, moderate liberal, and deist in the tradition of Voltaire, Newton, and Locke, converted to the Protestant faith in 1816 to 1817, thus sparing himself and his family the disadvantages which Jews were exposed in the Rhineland after Napoleon's fall and the annexation of this region to Prussia. The Marx children were baptized in 1824, the mother in 1825. In 1830, Karl entered the Trier secondary school, the Friedrich Wilhelm Gymnasium, and he was confirmed in the evangelical church of his town 4 years later. It evidently left a certain impression on Karl that his father had broken with the faith of their ancestors and converted the whole family to Protestantism, religion of a minority in the Catholic Rhineland. The day was to come when the young man would turn his attention to religious matters as well and pronounce against all forms of religious alienation. This is weird. It says 1835 to 1804. I don't know if that's a typo or if that's some tricky Rubel thing, but let's see. In August and September of 1835, Marx passed his school. It's probably I don't know. Who knows? In August and September of 1835, Marx passed his school-leaving examinations, for which he wrote a series of 7 compositions. His German essay, Reflections of a Young Man on the Choice of Profession, reflect the influence of the moral training he had enjoyed and to which he was perhaps particularly inclined. Quote, dignity can be gained only in a profession which does not reduce us to servile tools, one which permits us to create independently within our own realm. It is not always possible for us to assume the station in life for which we believe we have the calling. Our social relations have, to a certain extent, already begun forming before we are able to determine them, ... However, the decisive motive guiding us in our choice of profession must be the welfare of mankind, our own perfection, ... Man's nature is such that he can only attain his own perfection when working towards the perfection for the general welfare of his world, end quote. Marx. That's from the Mega. In his composition on religion, he remarked that, quote, the striving for knowledge supplants an inferior striving for earthly goods, ... When we reflect upon human nature, we always see indeed a divine spark in man's breast, an enthusiasm for the good, a striving for knowledge, a longing for truth, ... end quote. Marx matriculated in the autumn at the University of Bonn as a student of law. The first year he attended lectures on classical mythology and poetry, art history, and the courses in the history of Greek and Roman law and legal institutions as required of law students. Apart from his studies, Marx was active in student affairs and joined a circle of youths interested in poetry. An intimate correspondence sprung up between Marx and his father. All but one of the younger man's letters have been lost. From an early letter written by Heinrich Marx, we glean a notion of the father-son relationship and especially of the father's respect for Karl's intellectual talents. Quote, I wish to see in you what I might have become had I first seen the light of day under more favorable auspices, ... It may be unjust and ill-advised as well to put one's greatest hopes in a single person and thus perhaps undermine one's own equanimity. Heinrich Marx, 1835, November 18th to 29th. In Bonn, Marx rapidly accumulated a number of large debts which his father was forced to liquidate for him. The expenses of student life, books, and amusements as well kept the young man continually writing for money. Finally, in June, his excesses led to arrest on charges of drunken rowdiness. He served a one-night sentence for this on June 16, 1836. During the summer of 1836, he withdrew from Bonn with the intention of changing universities and became secretly engaged to his childhood sweetheart, Jenny von Westphalen. He lived from 1814 to 1881, daughter of Prussian Privy Councillor Johann Ludwig von Westphalen. 1770 to 1842, and his second wife, Caroline, née Rubel, who lived from 1779 to 1856. Jenny was descended on her father's side from the highest ranks of Scottish nobility, the Argyll and Campbell families. Her half-brother, Ferdinand von Westphalen, 1799 to 1876, of conservative Christian monarchical leanings, was the well-known Prussian Minister of Internal Affairs during the period of 1850 to 58. Jenny's brother Edgar was a Trier classmate of Marx's and entertained a close relationship with the young couple during their stay in Brussels in 1846. In October, Marx enrolled at the University of Berlin to continue his law studies. He attended lectures on Pandecta held by F.K. Savini, a penal law by Edward Gans, a converted Jew who became a Hegelian, and anthropology. He began writing verse and made all other poetic efforts, filling with lyrics 3 notebooks which he presented to his fiancée. Just a side note, I think Edward Gans is a very important figure in the history of Hegel and Hegel reception. I think Terry Pinkard, who's like one of the most well-known commentators on Hegel, I think he wrote a big fat biography on Hegel. Kind of like traces his interpretation of Hegel, which is kind of like a left interpretation of Hegel, to Edward Gans, I believe. I could be talking out of my ass. I'm not an expert on Hegel. I'm not an expert on Terry Pinkard. I'm definitely not an expert on Edward Gans, but that's my interpretation. I think he's a very important figure in the history of ideas, but I'm not sure of the exact dimensions of that importance. Although these romantic essays have been lost, a number of poems and ballads remain from the year 1837, along with a comic novel, Scorpion and Felix, and a dramatic fantasy, O&M, both in fragmentary form. Marx himself characterized his poetic writings as pure idealism, as, quote, onslaughts on the present, broad and shapeless expressions of feeling, unnatural, constructed out of the blue, the perfect opposite of what is actually there and what ought to be, rhetorical reflection instead of poetic thoughts, yet perhaps a certain warmth of sentiment and a struggle for dynamism as well, ... End quote. Marx to his father, November 10th, 1837. Among the extant poems are 4 short and critical epigrams on Hegel. In Marx's poetic interpretation, the great philosopher speaks as follows, quote, words I teach, confused in demonic chaos, so that each may thus think what pleases him, and in any case none is ever constrained by bridling limits. For, just as the poet conceives the words and thoughts of his beloved, out of a roaring torrent, tumbling from a lofty cliff, and what senses acknowledges, conceiving in thought what he feels, so may each man sip the delightsome nectar of wisdom. Indeed, I am telling you everything, having told you a nothing. End quote. Marx Perlet's reaction to his offspring's poetic inclinations and to his varied university activities was rather less than enthusiastic. Quote, it is now high time that you cure yourself of this restlessness which destroys mind and body, ... You have assumed serious responsibilities, ... You cannot imagine, with all the exaggerations and exaltations of love in a poetic spirit, that it is possible to establish the equanimity of that person to whom you have given yourself with body and soul, ... I have spoken with Jenny, ... She is making a priceless sacrifice for you. Only sober reason can appreciate the self-denial which she shows. May God protect you, should you ever in your life be able to forget this. End quote. Heinrich Marx, December 28, 1836. It is not surprising that Heinrich Marx was reluctant to sanction his son's early engagement, fearing his, quote, demonic and Faust-like nature, end quote, might put Karl in an unseemly position in face of his fiance's family and damage her reputation. Quote, I'm not pretending to be an angel, and I know that man does not live by bread alone, but any secondary intentions must be quelled when it is a question of fulfilling a sacred duty. And I repeat, a man has no more sacred duty than that which he assumes in the interest of the weaker sex. Thus I am asking you to be as open to me in this respect as in all others as you would be towards a friend. End quote. November 9th, 1836. I'm assuming that's Heinrich Marx. I'm not sure. Makes sense that it's Heinrich Marx, yeah. In the summer of 1837, Marx attended lectures in philosophy and history along with jurisprudence. He became involved in a group known as the Doctor Club. Students, recent graduates, and aspiring writers distinguished by their pronounced Hegelian leanings. Here Marx made friends with Bruno and Edgar Bauer, Carl Friedrich Kuppen, and Alfred Rutenberg, and others. Marx presented to his father a handwritten volume with a selection of his literary efforts for his birthday in March 1837. Heinrich Marx came to acknowledge this aspect of his son's talents and frequently referred to his desire for a literary career, suggesting how he might realize it without abandoning his plans for law. He felt, however, that this gifted young man was best suited for another career. Quote, I applaud your decision to make the teaching profession your goal, whether this be in jurisprudence or philosophy, and in the final analysis, I thought the latter would be the most fitting for you. End quote. Heinrich Marx, September 16th, 1837. Overshadowing these varied plans and aspirations, however, is a premonition of the difficult course which Marx's life was to take. Heinrich Marx wrote, quote, I cannot and will not hide my weakness for you. From time to time my heart swells up with thoughts of you and your future, and then sometimes I cannot rid myself of sad, portentous, and frightening feelings at moments when the thought strikes me like a bolt of lightning. Is your heart equal to your head and your talents? What brings me on to this train of thought? Something strange occurs to me when I regard Jenny. She, entirely devoted to you with her pure childlike heart, at times shows involuntarily, against her own will, a sort of fear pregnant with premonitions, a fear that does not escape me, but which I know not how to explain. What can this mean? I cannot explain it, yet unfortunately my experience keeps me from being easily led astray. End quote. Heinrich Marx, March 2nd, 1837. Despite or perhaps because of his affection for his son, Heinrich Marx did not let himself be blinded to Karl's weaknesses. The father's letters always remained candid, straightforward, and strict in their criticism. Marx could not ignore his father's questions and reproaches, and from his only extant letter, we have a detailed account of his studies in Berlin, his extracurricular activities, his personal aspirations. Here he first mentions his lifelong habit of, quote, scribbling down reflections, unquote, while making resumes or excerpts of books he read. He also recounted having composed, quote, a new basic system of metaphysics, end quote. Quote, a curtain had fallen. My most holy of holies was torn asunder and new gods had to be installed. Turning from the idealism which I had incidentally nourished and compared with that of Kant and Fichte, I came to seek the idea in reality itself, ... I had read fragments of Hegel's philosophy, but its grotesque and rocky melody I found displeasing, end quote. November 10th, 1837, Marx. He began writing a philosophical dialectical analysis of the concept of Gottheit, bracket, divinity, end bracket, manifested as religion, nature, and history. His ambition was to construct a new system of logic, uniting art and knowledge, which Marx considered were set at variance in contemporary speculation, but he completed his system. Quote, this, my most cherished offspring, nurtured by moonlight, delivers me into the arms of the enemy like a treacherous siren, end quote. This enemy was Hegel, whom Marx studied, quote, from beginning to end together with most of his disciples during a period of prolonged, end quote, during a period of prolonged illness earlier that year. On May 10th, 1838, Marx's father died in Trier. His last letters reflect the concern and discontent which preoccupied the ailing man as he learned of his son's intellectual crisis and irresponsible behavior. Quote, scarcely had the wild abandon and bond come to an end, your debts but recently paid, and these existed in numerous connections, when to further disconcert us, the love sorrows began. We have never had the consolation of a reasonable correspondence. We have never received an answer to our writings. Your letters never continued on from the previous ones, nor from our answers. The last letter contained only a few badly written lines and an excerpt from your diary entitled, quote, "A Visitor, whom I would much prefer to turn out of the house than to receive his company, a mad hack job, which simply announces how you are wasting your talents and staying up for nights on end in order to bring such monsters into the world, end quote. Heinrich Marx, December 9th, 1837. Henriette Marx, also concerned about her son's physical and mental well-being, procured him a medical certificate, which she sent with the remark, quote, "Enclosed you will find your certificate. Use every means possible to avoid your year of military service. You have every right to do so. Don't ignore your eye trouble. You will save yourself much annoyance and much money, end quote. Henrietta Marx, I guess, February 15th to 16th, 1838. His mother's thoughtfulness and devotion to her family were traits which Marx appreciated highly at the time, as is indicated in the following letter from Heinrich Marx to his son, quote, "You yourself have described in such beautiful terms the life of your fine mother. You felt so deeply how it has been a continued sacrifice of love and devotion, and in fact, your words were not exaggerated." End quote. Heinrich Marx, August 12th to 14th, 1837. In any event, Marx was exempted from his military service by the Trier Commission for the Recruitment of Military Personnel because of his health. The certificate read, quote, 1838, Karl Marx is admitted to voluntary military service in Berlin for 1 year, but at the present time is declared unfit for duty by the departmental physician in Berlin due to thoracic weakness and periodic coughing up of blood. The same for 1839. Schiel, die Umwelt des jungen Karl Marx, page 23. End quote. So that's the end of the certificate. (1839 to 1841). Marx began research in the philosophy of Epicurus in 1839 by preparing for a doctrinal thesis. During the summer semester in Berlin, he attended only one lecture course, quote, Jesaeus, given by Bruno Bauer. Marx frequently visited the Bauer home in Charlottenburg, and his friend encouraged him to write his thesis quickly and finish with the, quote, farce of an examination. Both young men felt that there was much to be done in Prussia, where the general problems were more diverse than elsewhere and complicated by political apathy. Bauer insisted that Marx prepare himself for the tasks ahead with the least possible delay. From the outset, Marx's work on the dissertation took a most un-Hegelian turn through the simple choice of Epicurus, a moral philosopher whose practical wisdom aimed at achieving peace of mind as the highest good. The preliminary notes and remarks for this paper are contained in 7 notebooks, all entitled Epicurean Philosophy. Included are excerpts from Epicurus, comments from Diogenes, Laertius, Sextus Empiricus, Plutarch, Gassendi, and Lucretius, as well as commentaries on Plato, Aristotle, and Hegel, and a schema of the Hegelian philosophy of nature. The themes thus touched upon: deformation of Hegelian philosophy by his followers, relation between Platonism and Christianity, the tasks of the philosophical historian, the Stoic ideal of the wise man, far surpassed the central orientation of the thesis itself. These notes reveal how Marx gained distance from Hegelian thinking. The state for Hegel was the incorporation of universal reason at its highest level. Thanks to the state of the realization of liberty in concrete form, human freedom becomes possible. Marx began his notes on Epicurus with passages on the Epicurean notion of the state, based in sharp contrast to that of Hegel, on contract and serving the principle of utility for its members. Neither deification of civil institutions nor attachment to any sort of alien god is to be found in Epicurus, who holds that, quote, the sole good which man has in relation to the world is the negative moment of being free from it, end quote. To use the words of Epicurus' celebrated disciple Lucretius, quote, for my song is first concerned with higher things.
I seek to liberate the spirits further from the bonds of religion, end quote. From these extracts, it seems that Marx's attention is drawn to Epicurus by his naturalness, his manifestation of intellectual and sensual freedom, a freedom from gods and from doctrines which concedes to chance an equally great, if not greater, role in human life as to necessity. Individual will is asserted, and understanding of contingency becomes central to the wisdom of life. Man free himself here from superstition and fear and becomes capable of forging his own happiness. Quote, further, Epicurus speaks out against simply staring at the heavenly bodies in rigid stupefaction as something limiting, generating fear. He asserts the value of absolute freedom of the mind, end quote. Marx. Man, conscious of his own will, his own self, and accepting the world as he finds it, gains control over his relations to this world and is able to attain the highest good to which human life may aspire, tranquility of mind. Science is clearly inessential for such a life, since natural phenomena only affect us as regards their subjective perception. Take the meteor, for example. Quote, it is all the same to the consciousness, end bracket, how the meteor is explained, and it maintains that not one explanation, but that several, i.e., that any explanation suffices. Thus it confesses its own action as active fiction, ... For in matters of specialized natural research, one must not hold to empty generalities and rules, but should accommodate himself to the demands of the appearances themselves, ... so that we may live in peace and security. End quote. Marx underlines Epicurus' naturalness in contrast with the Philistinism of Plutarch, his hero worship and traditional moralism. Plutarch, quote, babbles, trivializes, he reasons like a craftsman's apprentice, end quote. While Epicurus constructs a logical system of values and carries it to necessary practical conclusions, quote, Plutarch's syncretic mindless treatment cannot hold a candle to this, end quote. Marx commented and extended his criticism to all of philosophy, quote, ordinary thought always has abstract predicates at hand. Quote, ordinary thought always has abstract predicates at hand, which ordinary thought separates from the subject. All philosophers have made the predicates themselves into subjects, end quote. Marx. This Feuerbach-inspired remark is evidently meant for Hegel as well, but Marx nevertheless tried to save the Hegelian system by seeing in the Hegelian system his own ideal of a critical orientation towards the existing world order. Quote, ... But just as Prometheus, having stolen fire from heaven, began to build houses and to settle on the earth, so philosophy, having expanded to a world, turns against the visible world it finds. Thus Hegelian philosophy today, end quote. Marx. Marx's constant admiration for the early philosophers, which is linked with implied criticism of contemporary speculation, is frankly acknowledged as at the close of the sixth excerpt notebook. Quote, the Greeks will always remain our teachers because of the grandiose objective naivety which permits each object, though its rays be dim, to shine forth without drapings in the pure light of its own nature. Our time particularly has brought forth sinful phenomena, even in philosophy, phenomena tainted with the greatest sin, that against the mind and against truth, whereby a concealed intention is lodged behind the perception, and a concealed perception behind the thing itself, end quote. Marx. When working on his thesis, Marx conceived of a plan to write against certain academic authors who envisaged a reconciliation between philosophy and religion. He wanted to elaborate some of his thoughts in a farce to be entitled Fischer Vapulens, but the project never reached fruition. Having read and excerpted from Aristotle in an edition by Adolf Trendelenburg, Marx also planned to write a critique of Trendelenburg's Logische Untersuchungen. But again, nothing came of this. In autumn of 1839, Bruno Bauer departed from Berlin to take up a teaching post at Bonn University. Marx then became close friends with C.F. Kupen, who was 10 years his senior. Through the force of his unusual personality, Marx seems to have made such a striking impression on his friends that Kupen, for example, a man who was already established in the teaching profession, dedicated his pamphlet, Frederick the Great and His Antagonist, to the 22-year-old student. Kupen's writing was an apology for the royal philosopher and a passionate assertion of faith in reason and progress. Köppen claimed that Friedrich II's greatness as a thinker lay in his successful reconciliation of Epicureanism, Stoicism, and skepticism. Marx succeeded in publishing for the first time in 1841 two of his highly romantic poems entitled Wilde Lieder, Wild Songs, appeared in the magazine Athenaeum. I don't know, like Athenaeum is what it kind of looks like, and if you were to say it like, but my guess is Athenaeum, which had been founded by members of the former Doctorat Club. In March, Marx withdrew from Berlin and received the following academic report, quote, regarding his behavior at the university, there is nothing particularly unfavorable to be noted from the disciplinary point of view, and as for his financial affairs, we have only to report that he was brought to court several times for non-payment of debts. The aforementioned student has not been charged with participation in any illegal student society at this university up to the present date, end quote. Marx still had to submit his dissertation to a competent faculty in order to get his degree. Bauer encouraged him to do so, for, quote, it would be nonsense for you to devote yourself to a practical career. At present, theory is the most effective practice, and we cannot yet predict in how wide a sense it will become practical, end quote. Bauer. So in April, Marx sent his finished thesis to the philosophical faculty at the University of Jena. His reasons for choosing Jena were the ease and lower financial outlay involved in procuring a doctoral degree from a smaller, little-known German university. Without a public examination as was required in both Bonn and Berlin, Marx was granted his diploma a week after submitting the thesis, April 15, 1841, which he had dedicated to Jenny's father, Ludwig von Westphalen. Quote, not ideology nor vain hypotheses do we need for our life, but to live without confusion, end quote. Marx might well have made this quotation from Epicurus the motto of his dissertation, so accurately does it reflect the substance of the paper. Although the breadth of the material treated in the actual thesis is much more restricted than in the preliminary writings, it nevertheless does justice to the intentions stated in the preface. Quote, Hegel had, to be sure, correctly determined the general characteristics of the systems mentioned, ... Yet, for one, it was still impossible to delve into details. For another, this grandiose thinker was hindered by his view of what he termed, quote, speculative, par excellence, from recognizing the deep purpose of these systems in the history of Greek philosophy, and for the Greek mind in general, ... I hope to have solved one problem in the history of Greek philosophy which has been left unexplained up until now. End quote. Marx. In this paper, a clear contrast is made between two conceptions of philosophy, what it is and the ends it serves, as expressed in the writings of Epicurus and Democritus. The dissertation was formally entitled, quote, The Difference Between the Philosophies of Nature in Democritus and Epicurus. Democritus conceived of philosophy as empirical knowledge. Quote, unsatisfied in philosophy, he throws himself into the arms of positive knowledge, end quote. Marx wrote, although there is evidently a difference between philosophy as wisdom of life and science as empirical life experience, Democritus attempted to fuse the two. Philosophy becomes science. The result is that, quote, the knowledge he holds to be true is meaningless for his own life, while the knowledge which gives him substance is without truth, and so he rejects it, end quote. Epicurus, by contrast, rejects the positive sciences as worthless for the attainment of true human perfection. For Marx, the efficacy of each thinker's philosophy is evidenced in his satisfaction with the life he has led. Quote, while Democritus, finally despairing of knowledge, puts out his eyes at last, Epicurus, as he feels the hour of death approaching, climbs into a warm bath, desires pure wine, and recommends to his friends that they be faithful to philosophy. End quote. Marx. The subjectivity of each thinker's concept of philosophy is evident. In the general relationship which he established between the world and abstract thought, the philosopher is simply objectifying the way in which his particular consciousness relates to the real world. Necessity is in Democritus the principle of his rigid determinism. However, for Epicurus, who does not hold science to be the goal of human effort, but rather man's own perfection, quote, necessity is an evil, but there is no necessity to live under the control of necessity. Everywhere the paths to freedom are open are many, short and simple, end quote. I guess I don't know if that's Marx or Epicurus. I'm not sure. Epicurus derives his knowledge ex principio internum. He is therefore the sovereign of his life, complete within himself, an entire being, and not one who leans upon something outside himself, as Democritus leans upon his teachers. In short, Marx brought out the distinction between philosophy as wisdom of life and philosophy as the totality of the empirical sciences, according to Democritus, whereby Marx's own bias for the former thinker is not difficult to discern. In one of the notes appended to the dissertation, Marx briefly considered the question of the relationship between philosophy and praxis, presenting the two as inseparable. Quote, philosophical praxis is itself theoretical. It is the criticism which measures the individual existence against the essence and particular reality against the idea. Yet this immediate realization of philosophy is burdened with contradictions in its innermost essence, while this essence manifests itself in appearance, leaving its mark thereupon. End quote. Marx, now a fresh university graduate, was full of plans and inspiration, but as yet had no actual professional occupation. In a letter to the novelist Berthold Auerbach, Moses Hess characterizes his 23-year-old friend Marx as, quote, the greatest, perhaps the only real philosopher living today, ... Dr. Marx, ... is still a very young man and is going to give the death blow to medieval religion and politics. He combines the sharpest wit with the most profound philosophical gravity. Imagine Rousseau, Voltaire, Holbach, Lessing, Heine, and Hegel united in one person, and I mean united, not thrown together. There you have Dr. Marx. End quote. Moses Hess, September 2nd, 1841. At the beginning of July 1841, Marx moved to Bonn from Trier, where he had spent the intervening months since receiving his degree in April. In Bonn, he continued to see much of Bruno Bauer and planned with Bauer and Ludwig Feuerbach to bring out a periodical entitled Archiv des Atheismus, which they were determined to make more radically left-wing than Arnold Ruge's Deutsche Jahrbucher. Georg Jung, at the time involved in preparations for founding a paper to be called the Rheinische Zeitung, reported in a letter to Ruge that, quote, Dr. Marx, Dr. Bauer, and L. Feuerbach are getting together to make up a philosophical journal, and when so, may all the angels gather round old God the Father, and may he have mercy on himself. For these three are certain to throw him out of his heaven and chase him with a legal suit to boot. Marx, for one, calls the Christian religion one of the most immoral, and he is, by the way, albeit a most despairing revolutionary, one of the cleverest heads I know. End quote. And that quote was from Georg Jung. Bauer was suspended from his lecturing post in Bonn for the winter semester 1841-42, and in May 1842 his dismissal was made permanent. This is a punishment for proposing a toast in the spirit of the left Hegelians. Marx too saw his hopes for a university career sink radically. In November 1841, Bauer published an anonymous pamphlet on which Marx was assumed to have collaborated, entitled The Trumpet of the Last Judgment on Hegel, the Atheist, and Antichrist. An ultimatum. This tract presented under the pretext of attacking Hegel's atheism, a philosophy of universal consciousness, which had little in common with Hegel's Weltgeist. (1842 to 1843). In January 1842, Marx again returned to Trier to the bedside of the ailing Ludwig von Westphalen. He remained at the Westphalen home until the older man's death on March 3rd, helping the family and devoting little time to his own affairs. He wrote, nevertheless, one article which he intended to publish in Ruge's Deutsche Jahrbucher, entitled Remarks on the Latest Prussian Censorship Instruction. Appropriately enough, the Saxonian censor prohibited its appearance in Ruge's Dresden journal, and thus it was not published until the following year in a volume called Anecdota. Also edited by Ruge, The latter journal was used to bring out those articles and other writings rejected by the Prussian censors. Marx's contribution, signed simply by, quote, by a Rhenish citizen, end quote, closed with the following quotation from Tacitus, quote, "Rare is the good fortune of those times in which one may think what one wishes and say what one thinks," end quote. It is interesting to note that the last chapter of Spinoza's Tractatus had a title derived from the above quotation. Marx's excerpt notebook showed that he had actually been reading Spinoza during the early part of 1841. His knowledge of Judaism, later criticized in his essay on the Jewish question, probably stemmed from Spinoza's Tractatus, apart from which Marx made 2 notebooks of extracts from Spinoza's correspondence. Spinoza states in his Tractatus that democracy is, quote, "of all forms of government, the most natural and most consonant with individual liberty," end quote. Marx's article on Prussian censorship presented the democratic state as the ethical state, which, quote, ... presupposes a, quote, sense of state, end quote, bracket, Staatsgesinnung, and bracket, in its members, even though they should oppose an organ of the state, end quote. Marx. But a government which presumed alone to incorporate reason and morality, quote, such a government invents tendentious laws of revenge, ... based on the lack of character and on an unethical and materialist view of the state, end quote. Following his stay in Trier, Marx announced to Ruge his newest writing projects and promised to send as soon as possible 2 articles, one on Christian art, the second a critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, the core of which, quote, is the struggle against the constitutional monarchy as a hybrid thing which is thoroughly self-contradictory and occasions its own dissolution. There is no German translation for Respublika. March 5th. End quote. Marx, March 5th, 1842. In a subsequent letter, Marx reported that he had expanded the article on Christian art to a study entitled Religion and Art, with special emphasis on Christian art, and was thus delayed in delivering it. A few days later, he wrote that he was nearly finished and promised Ruge 4 articles: 1. On religious art, 2. On the Romantics, 3. A critique of the historical school of law, and 4. On the positive philosophies. On the, quote, positive philosophers. Of these, only the 3rd essay ever appeared in published form. In preparing his articles, Marx read and excerpted numerous passages from Christoph Meiner's Allgemeine Kritische Geschichte der Religionen, 1806, Jean Barbirac's Traité de la morale des pères de l'Église, Charles de Brosse's Über den Dienst der Fetischgötter, 1785, Karl August Böttinger's Ideen zur Kunstmythologie, 1826-36, Johann Jakob Grun's Die Malerei der Griechen, 1810, Karl Friedrich von Rumohr's Italienische Forschungen, 1827, and Lorenz Stein's book Der Sozialismus und Kommunismus des heutigen Frankreichs, 1842. In April 1842, Marx moved to Bonn, where he began writing for the Rheinische Zeitung. His first contribution was a series of essays on the proceedings of the 6th Rhenish Parliament, which had met in Dusseldorf from May to June of the preceding year. The first essay, Debates on the Freedom of the Press and the Publication of the Parliamentary Proceedings, appeared in 6 installments in May. The second, concerning the religious dispute in Cologne, was struck out by the censor. The third, Debates on the Law Punishing Wood Theft, appeared in 5 issues of the paper during October and November. Later, in 1859, Marx remarked that these articles, together with a series on the misery of the wine growers in the Moselle Valley, first gave him an opportunity to delve into economic questions. In this connection, Marx's first direct confrontation with the ideas of Saint-Simon and other French socialists seems to have come from the Rheinische Zeitung articles published by Moses Hess and Gustav Methesen, and probably as well as from Lorenz Stein's book Socialism and Communism in Contemporary France, which appeared this same year and was reviewed in the columns of the Rheinische Zeitung. However, it was unlikely that Marx read Stein before leaving Germany in October 1843. At the outset, he was distrustful of this, quote, faint philosophic echo of French socialism echoed in the Rheinische Zeitung, especially when produced by the pen of Berlin Freien, a radical group of individualists with anarchistic leanings, which also published in the Rheinische Zeitung. In a letter to Rüger, Marx detailed his objections to their writings, quote, ... I held that it was unsuitable and indeed immoral to smuggle communist and socialist dogmas, i.e. a new worldview, into incidental theater reviews, etc., and I desired quite a different and more profound discussion of communism if it were to be discussed at all, end quote. Marx, November 30th, 1842. In these early newspaper articles, Marx directed his attention towards the problem of freedom. His approach is strongly philosophical. Quote, freedom is so essentially a part of human nature that even its opponents help to realize it in combating its reality. They want to appropriate for themselves this precious jewel which they deny is a jewel of human nature. ... The danger which threatens the life of every being is that of losing itself. The mortal danger, therefore, for every human being is that of losing his freedom, end quote. Marx. 1 second. Let me get some water here. Sorry about that. The press of a nation constitutes, according to Marx, the, quote, intellectual mirror in which a people observes itself, and since, quote, observation of self is the first prerequisite of wisdom, end quote, repressive censorship laws which prevent the people from attaining wisdom must be vehemently condemned, quote. In order to fight against freedom of the press, one must defend the standpoint that the human race is incapable of reaching maturity. ... If man's immaturity is the mystic reason which speaks against freedom of the press, then censorship is in any event a most highly reasonable measure to assure that men never mature, end quote. In May and June, Marx was temporarily in Trier due to a death in the family. Personal problems developed and Marx wrote to Rüger, quote, my family has caused me difficulties which expose me for the moment to the most depressing financial circumstances despite their being well off. It would not be right for me to burden you with the tale of these private infamies. It is truly fortunate that public infamies make it impossible for any man of character to let himself be irritated by the private ones, end quote. Marx, July 7th, 1842. Of the 4 articles promised Rüger for his Zurich publication, Anekdote, only the one on the historical school of law appeared in print. In the Rheinische Zeitung, however, not an Anekdote. The article was unsigned, and a chapter on marriage was cut out by the censor. Marx's standpoint here is a rejection of the theoretical view which sees present life as the corruption of a once perfect and absolute state of nature. He maintains instead that, quote, as every century has its own particular nature, so does it engender its own particular natural man, end quote. Marx. On October 15th, Marx, now settled in Cologne, began work as editor-in-chief of the Rheinische Zeitung. In the early editorial, he repudiated an attack by the Augsburger Allgemeine Zeitung, accusing the Rheinische Zeitung of communist tendencies. For the first time, Marx mentioned the names Fourier, Leroux, Considerant, and Proudhon, and termed the work of the latter, quote, insightful. The Rheinische Zeitung, Marx announced, was going to submit socialist ideas rigorous criticism for, quote, ... I ideas which have won our minds and conquered our way of thinking, ideas forged to our conscience by reason, are chains we cannot break out of without breaking our hearts. They are demons which we can overcome only by acquiescing to them." End quote. Marx. As editor of the Rheinische Zeitung, Marx found himself caught in a dual conflict. On the one side, he faced the paper's shareholders intent on moderating the editor's political tendency, and on the other, he was challenged by the Freien, whose superficial articles on communism and atheism Marx rejected. About November 24th, he received a letter from Edward Mayen, written in the name of the Berlin radicals, demanding that he justify his editorial policy. In the midst of this conflict, Friedrich Engels paid his first visit to Marx in Cologne on the way to England, where he conducted business for his father's spinning mills in Manchester. Since Engels stood close to the Berlin Freien at that time, it is not surprising that Marx received him rather coolly. Towards the end of November, the situation finally ripened to an open break between the editor-in-chief and his Berlin contributors, while Engels, tending more and more towards a communist viewpoint, published in the Rheinische Zeitung his first articles on the condition of the working class in England. In November-December, the Rheinische Zeitung published 3 articles on the increasingly critical situation of the wine-growing peasants in the Moselle Valley. The first president of the Rhineland province, von Schapper, issued an official denial of the alleged conditions and accused the Rheinische Zeitung of false reporting, of calumny, and of stirring up dissatisfaction among the populace. Marx came to the defense of the correspondence reports in 2 articles published in January 1843. Marx also devoted a 3-part article to a critique of the Prussian constitution, which was based on the existence of fixed classes or, quote, estates, Stände. In this article, published in December, Marx attacked the particularism of parliamentary representation according to such a constitution. Quote, "The Landtage are, because of their unique composition, nothing more than a society of special interest privileged with the opportunity of making valid their particular limits to state encroachment. In other words, they are justified self-constituted anti-state elements within the state. They are therefore by nature inimical to the state, since in its isolated activity any special element is always an enemy to the whole. It is precisely this whole which conveys to the particular a feeling of its nothingness by giving it an awareness of its limits." End quote. Marx. Staff and shareholders were informed at the beginning of 1843 that a government edict had been issued forbidding further publication of the Rheinische Zeitung after April 1st. This measure was taken on the demand of the Tsar Nicholas I after an outspoken article against Russian absolutism appeared in the paper on January 4th, 1843. Marx was relieved that he would soon be free of the shackling censorship regulations. He wrote to Ruge, quote, "I cannot begin anything anew in Germany. Here one is forced to corrupt oneself, ... To me, the suppression of the Rheinische Zeitung represents progress in political consciousness, ... It is a bad state of affairs when one has to perform menial tasks even for freedom and to fight with pins instead of clubs. I tired of this hypocrisy, stupidity, brute authority, and of our having to give in, to conform, to turn our backs to things and to split hairs." End quote. Marx, January 25th, 1843. Disappointed in the shareholders for their timidity in defending the paper's staff, Marx resigned his position before the actual end of publication, March 17th, 1843. His final comments on the government edict are incorporated in a protest address directed to the Prussian government by the shareholders. Marx declared on the 12th of February 1843 that the policies of the Rheinische Zeitung had always been aimed at serving the true interests of the state. The government officials thought otherwise, however. In a remark noted on the margin of a letter from the censor Wilhelm St. Paul, a certain Councillor Bitter pointed out that Marx's ultra-democratic inclinations were the antithesis of the principles upon which the Prussian state was founded. In a letter to Ruge, some weeks before his displacement, Marx had already broached the topic of founding a new journal. He suggested that they should publish this new, quote, "People's Periodical," as he envisaged the future radical organ, in Zurich, with the cooperation of the poet Georg Herwegh. Once the contract was concluded, Marx was determined to go to Kreuznach, where Jenny, his fiancée of 7 years, was awaiting him. He confessed to Ruge, quote, "Without any romanticism whatsoever, I can assure you that I am head over heels in love, and my love is as serious as can be. I have been engaged for 7 years now, and my bride-to-be has fought the hardest battles for me, very nearly ruining her health in the doing." End quote. Marx, March 13th, 1843. Whatever their fate should be, Marx was set on marrying before leaving Germany, although his financial situation was not very promising. Having broken with his family, Marx was unable to touch his paternal inheritance as long as his mother was alive. Toward the end of March, Marx made a trip to Holland, presumably to discuss the matter of his inheritance with his mother's Dutch relatives. While still in Cologne, Marx read Feuerbach's preliminary thesis on the Reformation of philosophy, published in 1842, which he commented on to Ruge. Quote, "I take exception to Feuerbach's aphorisms only in one connection. He refers to nature too often and neglects politics. Yet the only way to transform contemporary philosophy into reality is through an alliance with politics." End quote. Marx, March 13th, 1843. That's actually a really good quote. I really like that. I'm going to repeat that because it seems important. In terms of like how Marx conceptualizes human society in nature in a very general way. Quote, "I take exception to Feuerbach's aphorisms only in one connection. He refers to nature too often and neglects politics. Yet the only way to transform contemporary philosophy into reality is through an alliance with politics." End quote. March 13th, 1843. Marx is on the move again in May, this time to Dresden, where he conferred with Ruge on the subject of their joint literary enterprise. Their intention was now to publish Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher, Franco-German Annals, either in Paris or in Strasbourg. Finally, at the end of the month, Marx moved to Kreuznach, where Jenny and her mother were living. The marriage ceremony, civil and religious, took place on June 19th in Kreuznach. Shortly thereafter, Marx received an offer which he immediately rejected to enter the Prussian civil service as editor-in-chief of the Preußische Staatszeitung. During his sojourn in Kreuznach, he devoted himself to a study of the revolutions in France, England, and America. A number of his readings helped him arrive at a view of communism as the inevitable outcome of democracy. He also undertook a, quote, critical revision of Hegel's political philosophy. This critique, the bulk of which was most probably written in Kreuznach, marks his open and definitive break with Hegel's idea of the state and acknowledges democracy as the, quote, solution to the enigma of all constitutions, end quote. Quote, "Man does not exist for the benefit of the law. The law exists for the benefit of man. Law is human existence. Whereas in all other political forms, man has only juridical existence. This is the main distinction of democracy," end quote. Marx. Marx's conception of democracy goes as far as to question the existence of the state as a political body in democracy, and he suggests that in some way the state is to be overcome. Quote, "Recent French thinkers have understood this as meaning that the political state disappears in a true democracy. This is correct insofar as the state, qua political constitution, is no longer valid for the whole," end quote. Marx. Marx renounced altogether the idea of the state as a rational institution, and with it, Hegel's system, which culminated in the state as the highest embodiment of reason. While pretending to a spiritualism of the highest order, Hegel's justification of the existing monarch is, according to Marx, nothing better than the crassest materialism. Reading Hegel, one discovers that, quote, "At all the highest points in the political state, it is the contingency of birth, which makes certain individuals into the embodiments of the highest political tasks. The highest activities in the state are attributed to individuals according to birth, just as the situation of an animal, its nature, way of life, etc., is given immediately at its birth. The state in its highest function is endowed with an animal-like reality," end quote. Marx. Within this structure, the bureaucracy develops what is actually the form of the state, constitutes and perpetuates itself as its content. The bureaucratic mind is engendered, quote, "a Jesuitical, theological mind through and through," end quote. Quote, "The aims of the state transform themselves into the aims of bureau, or the aims of bureau into those of the state. The bureaucracy is a circle from which no one can escape. The bureaucracy's hierarchy is a hierarchy of knowledge," end quote. Marx. Control over this knowledge in the Hegelian state means that the subjects are deprived of participation in political life. They are virtually forced to live outside the state, and their sole access to it is by examination, which admits them to the echelons of the bureaucracy. Quote, ... The examination is nothing other than the bureaucratic baptism of knowledge, the official recognition of the transubstantiation of profane knowledge into sacred. It goes without saying that for every examination, the examinator knows all. We do not hear about Greek or Roman statesmen ever taking examinations, but what then is a Roman statesman in comparison with a member of the Prussian government? End quote. Marx. Hegel's superstitious deification of the state, Marx explained, originated in his particular mode of thought which reversed subject and object. Whereas in reality man experiences existence as both political and social, Hegel in his fantastic abstractions separates the political aspect of man, an attribute, from man and examines it as an abstract entity embodied in the state. Quote, he made it a product, a predicate of the idea, what is actually its subject. He does not develop his thought from the object, but rather he develops the object according to thought, which is complete in itself and in the abstract sphere of logic. It is not a task of developing the particular idea of the political constitution, but of relating the political constitution to the abstract idea, of giving it a place in the life story of the idea, what evidently amounts to mystification. End quote. Marx. The studies pursued during this period contributed fundamentally to Marx's subsequent formulation of the, quote, materialist view of history. He excerpted 50 pages of notes from the German translation of a book entitled Men and Manners in America, 1833, by Thomas Hamilton. The Scotsman Hamilton had observed in the United States certain inequalities in class relations which he held to be incompatible with true democracy. In Hamilton, Marx found what de Tocqueville had failed to notice, the revolutionary implications of American democracy. Hamilton derived the historical necessity of a rupture in American society from the social discrepancies, the class barriers founded on and reinforced by an unequal educational system, quote, incompatible with the true democratic principle of absolute equality, end quote. From this he concluded that, quote, ... if the question be conceded that democracy necessarily leads to anarchy and spoliation, it does not seem that the mere length of the road to be traveled is a point of much importance. In the United States, with the great advantages they possess, it may continue a generation or two longer, but the termination is the same. The doubt regards time, not destination. End quote. Hamilton. Thomas Hamilton. Other works read by Marx at this time include Rousseau's Du Contrat Social, published in 1762, Montesquieu's L'Esprit de l'Oie, 1748, Machiavelli's Il Principe, in German translation, de Tocqueville's De la démocratie en Amérique, I don't know, 1835 to 1840, Auguste Beaumont de la Boninière, Marie ou de l'esclavage au État uni, 1835. Still planning to collaborate on the Deutsche Französische Jahrbuch, now intended for publication in Paris, Marx corresponded with Ruge and defined his concept of the new journal's policy. It must be unwavering in its criticism of the existing order in the name of humanity. It should support the political fight for a democratic system which should encompass more than the machinery of a political state. It should strive to reform the individual's consciousness not by means of communist or socialist dogmas, but through analysis of confusion, be it of religious or political nature, in the human consciousness. Among the writings completed during the Kreuznach period was the essay On the Jewish Question, composed at a time when Marx was severing his last ties with the idealist Hegelian notion of the state and bureaucracy, and at a time when the conflict with his Jewish relations in money matters was particularly acute. His essay has overtones which recall a, quote, prophetic diatribe against money and the state. Published in 1844 in the Deutsche Französische Jahrbuch, this essay on the critique of the Hegelian philosophy of right, probably written in Paris at the end of 1843, constitutes the first draft of a communist manifesto which was to be given its final form in the text of 1848. Marx and his wife left Germany for Paris on October 11th. There they lodged in an apartment in Rue Venue, situated in the area of Faubourg Saint-Germain, where their neighbors were other German immigrants including Herwig and Ruge. Heinrich Heine became a regular visitor to the Marxes beginning in December, and the two men saw much of one another during the coming months. The end. Thank you for listening.